He worked 16 hours a day. He weighed every gram, memorized every customer's face, extended credit he couldn't afford to lose, and he still went broke. Victorian England was the wealthiest nation on earth. But inside those small shops lining the streets of Manchester and London, a silent war was being fought, and most shopkeepers were already losing before they even opened their doors. The system looked simple: buy goods, sell goods, keep the difference. But there was no price tag on anything. Every single sale had to be negotiated by hand, face to face, while rent climbed, taxes multiplied, and the customer demanded credit she had no intention of repaying next month. Assistants lived on the premises. Stock sat locked behind counters. Department stores undercut every price. And one bad winter, one wave of unpaid debts, could erase 10 years of work in a single season. Most of them vanished without a record. Not because they failed to work hard enough, because the game was never designed for them to win. To understand how that happened, and why so many men and women who built their lives around a counter, a ledger, and the stubborn belief that hard work pays off, ended up losing everything, we need to go back, not to the grand halls of Parliament, not to the factory floors, but to the narrow gaslit streets of Victorian England, where ordinary people dared to dream of something smaller and more dangerous than fortune. They dared to dream of a shop of their own. If stories like this one, where the world that looks orderly on the surface hides something far darker underneath, if that pulls you in, consider subscribing and drop a comment telling me, where in the world are you watching this from now? To truly understand what a Victorian shopkeeper was up against, we have to understand the world that surrounded him. Between 1837 and 1901, Great Britain underwent a transformation that had no precedent in human history. Cities doubled in size within a single generation. Manchester, which had been a modest market town at the start of the century, became a roaring industrial metropolis of nearly 500,000 people by its middle decades. Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool, Sheffield. Each of these cities swelled with workers who had left the countryside behind, drawn by the promise of wages and the noise of progress. The streets were loud, crowded, and filled with the smell of coal smoke and horse dung. The skies above the factories were permanently grey. And through all of it, through the clattering machinery and the endless procession of wagons and carts, commerce moved like blood through a body, loud, fast, and absolutely essential to everything that kept the empire alive. This was the age of industry, the age of empire, the age of the railway and the telegraph and the steam press. Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the world's surface, and the wealth that flowed through London was staggering by any measure. The Bank of England processed transactions that would seem extraordinary even by modern standards. Merchant houses negotiated contracts that spanned continents. The docks at Liverpool and Bristol handled goods from every corner of the globe. But wealth in the Victorian era was not distributed. It was concentrated. The industrialists who owned the mills and the railways and the mines lived in a world entirely separate from the men and women who worked inside them. And somewhere between those two worlds, between the factory owner in his manor house and the worker in his rented room, there existed another class entirely. A class that has been largely forgotten: the small shopkeeper. The man or woman who stood behind a counter for 14 hours a day, selling tea, flour, ribbon, candles, soap and bread to people who needed them. Not because they had chosen commerce out of passion, but because commerce seemed, from a certain angle, like the only door left open. His name was Thomas Alderton, and he had been born in 1841 in a village outside Coventry, the second son of a tenant farmer whose land had been swallowed whole by enclosure acts that redistributed common ground to large landowners with the cold efficiency of law. Thomas was not poor in the theatrical sense. He was poor in the quiet, grinding way that slowly removes options from a life until only one remains. His father had lost the farm when Thomas was 11. By 14, Thomas was working in a dry goods warehouse in Coventry, carrying boxes, sweeping floors, and learning, and without anyone intending to teach him, how commerce actually functioned from the inside. He was observant. He watched how the owner of the warehouse dealt with suppliers, how he priced goods, how he extended credit to reliable customers, and cut off those who delayed payment too long. He watched the flow of inventory, the logic of margins, the way a good relationship with a regular buyer could mean the difference between a profitable week and a disastrous one. Thomas was not educated in the formal sense. He had perhaps 4 years of irregular schooling, but he understood numbers in the way that practical men often do, not as abstractions, but as consequences. By the time he was 26, he had saved enough, barely, to lease a small shop on a side street in Birmingham. It was narrow, dark, and smelled of damp wood and old plaster. The front window was cracked in the lower corner. The shelves needed rebuilding, but it was his. Or as close to his as a man with no family inheritance could ever claim. He stocked it carefully with what he could afford: tea, sugar, candles, dried goods, a small selection of fabrics. He hand-lettered a sign above the door. And on the morning of April the 3rd, 1867, Thomas Alderton opened for business. He believed with the complete sincerity of a man who had worked his entire life toward a single goal that this was the beginning of something. He was right. It was. He simply had no way of knowing what kind of beginning it actually was. The first year went better than Thomas had any right to expect. The neighborhood around his shop was dense with working families. Iron workers, seamstresses, clerks, domestic servants who had their half-days on Thursdays and Sundays. They needed what he sold, and he was close enough to their daily routes that stopping in required no special effort. He learned their names quickly. He remembered that Mrs. hardly took her tea strong, and that the foreman at the iron foundry 2 streets over sent his boy every Friday morning for a pound of sugar and a quarter pound of tobacco. Thomas kept a ledger with meticulous, slightly labored handwriting. Every sale recorded, every credit extended noted in red ink with the customer's name and amount owed. The credit system was not something Thomas had invented. It was simply how commerce worked at street level in Victorian England. Wages were paid weekly, sometimes fortnightly, and a family's cash on hand at any given moment was rarely sufficient for every immediate need. The shopkeeper who refused credit was a shopkeeper without customers, so Thomas extended it, cautiously at first, then more regularly as trust built and accounts were settled. For most of the first year the ledger balanced, not generously, but it balanced. He paid his rent on time. He paid his supplier on time. He ate. He slept on a cot in the room behind the shop, because it made no financial sense to rent separate lodgings. The shop was his home, his livelihood, and the entire architecture of his identity. He had no separation between himself and the business, because there was no separation to be had. But something was already wrong, though Thomas could not yet see it clearly. The margins on every item he sold were thinner than they appeared. Tea cost him more per pound than he had initially calculated, because his supplier in Birmingham charged a premium to small buyers that larger merchants simply did not pay. The scales he used were accurate, but the price negotiations with customers ground down his margins transaction by transaction. And the rent, payable to a landlord who owned half the street, had a clause Thomas had not fully understood when he signed. It would increase by 5% annually for the first 5 years of the lease. The second year brought the first real fracture, not dramatically, not in the way that makes for clean stories. It came the way most commercial failures come, gradually, through the accumulation of small pressures that each seemed manageable in isolation, but together formed a weight that no single man could carry indefinitely. The rent increase arrived in March. It was not catastrophic on its own, an additional 2 shillings and 4 pence per week, but Thomas was already operating on a margin so thin that every additional fixed cost required him to either sell more or cut something else. He cut his own food first. He began eating 1 proper meal a day instead of 2. Then he reduced the range of fabrics he stocked, eliminating the more expensive grades that few of his customers could afford anyway. Then he began extending credit more broadly, not because he had grown reckless, but because the alternative was losing regular customers to the larger grocer that had opened 3 streets away on the main road. With a painted facade and a broader selection, and the advantage of bulk purchasing that allowed prices Thomas simply could not match. The larger grocer's name was Whitmore & Sons, and it represented something Thomas hadn't fully anticipated: the structural shift already underway in Victorian retail. Whitmore wasn't a department store. It wasn't Harrods or Whiteley's, but it was large enough to buy directly from wholesalers at rates unavailable to a man running a single-room shop with limited capital. Where Thomas paid 4p per pound for a grade of tea, Whitmore paid 3p. That penny difference, compounded across every item in the shop, every day, every week, meant that Whitmore could undercut Thomas's prices and still profit more. Thomas began to feel, for the first time, that his effort and Whitmore's advantage were not operating in the same commercial universe. Because they weren't. He worked harder. He opened earlier and closed later. He began offering small services, weighing out pre-measured parcels on Tuesday evenings for women who didn't have time to come in on Wednesday mornings. He wrote delivery notes in his careful hand and delivered small orders himself on Sunday afternoons, walking through the cold Birmingham streets with a basket, just to keep the accounts from slipping. His boots wore through at the sole. He had them resoled twice before he admitted that the leather had gone past saving, but the ledger was changing character. The red ink, the credit extended, was growing faster than the black ink of payment received. By the winter of 1869, the unpaid accounts had reached a number Thomas could no longer explain away as temporary. 14 families owed him money. The total was not enormous in absolute terms, perhaps £3 and 7 shillings, but against his weekly operating surplus of less than a shilling it was an abyss. One family had moved without notice, leaving behind 2 months of credit and nothing else. Another had a husband who had been laid off at the foundry, and whose wife came in every week with genuine shame in her eyes and a story about next week that never resolved into payment. Thomas did not cut them off. He could not. He had known that woman for 2 years. Her children came into the shop on their way home from school on Fridays, and she always paid at least a portion of what she owed. To refuse her credit was to lose her completely, and to gain the reputation, fatal to a small shopkeeper, of a man who couldn't be trusted in hard times. He was trapped between 2 versions of financial ruin: extend credit and absorb the losses, refuse credit and lose the customers. Neither road led anywhere survivable. The same winter brought a cold snap that lasted 6 weeks longer than anyone had expected. Coal prices spiked. The foundries cut shifts. 3 of Thomas's most reliable customers, men who had never once failed to settle their weekly accounts, suddenly found themselves with reduced wages and the impossible arithmetic of rent, food, and heat competing for the same insufficient sum. Thomas felt the impact immediately. The shop's weekly take dropped by nearly a third. He stopped paying himself entirely, not that there had been much to take. He began delaying his supplier payments by a week, then 2. His supplier, a man named Garvey who had always been polite but had never pretended at warmth, sent a note in January of 1870 that was carefully worded but unmistakable in meaning. Terms were cash on delivery until accounts were current. Thomas sat in his shop that January evening. The fire burned low to save coal. A single tallow candle lit on the counter, the ledger open in front of him. He ran the numbers for the 4th time that week. They did not change. They never changed. And something in the particular quality of the silence that night, the way the wind pushed against the cracked corner of the front window, the smell of cold wood and old paper, made it impossible to pretend any longer that the problem was temporary. Before we get to what happened next, if this story has made you look at the idea of honest work and fair reward in a slightly different way, subscribe to the channel, because the stories we tell here are about the systems most people never see, the ones that were there long before us. And drop a comment. Do you think Thomas had any real way out, or was the ending already written? The spring of 1870 did not bring the recovery Thomas had managed to believe in through the winter. It brought instead the final sequence of events that would close his shop before the year was out. In April, the landlord exercised his right to a 3rd rent increase, the full 5%, non-negotiable, payable from the 1st of May. Thomas wrote back requesting a temporary reduction given the economic conditions of the neighborhood. The landlord did not reply. In May, Whitmore and Sons expanded. They leased the vacant premises next door and knocked through the wall, creating a shop nearly 4 times the size of Thomas's. They brought in a young man from London who had experience in retail display and who arranged the new storefront in a way that made Whitmore's look modern, bright, and welcoming, in a manner Thomas's shop simply could not compete with. Whitmore began marking prices on small cards placed next to the goods, a practice just beginning to appear in the larger establishments, which eliminated the negotiation entirely and made shopping faster and less uncomfortable for customers who had always found haggling slightly distasteful. Thomas watched the change and understood it immediately. It was not a gimmick. It was the future. By August, 3 of his 14 regular credit accounts had written him small notes, polite, apologetic, sincere, explaining that they would be doing their shopping at Whitmore's from now on, where the prices were somewhat lower and where payment was immediate rather than on account. They thanked him for his years of service. 2 of them owed him money they did not mention. Thomas closed the shop on the 14th of September, 1870. Not with drama, not with a collapse or a scandal or a scene of any recognizable theatrical weight. He simply stopped opening the door in the mornings. He packed what remained of his stock, a fraction of what he had started with, worth perhaps 12 shillings in total, into 2 crates. He settled what debts he could with what he had. He paid his last month's rent in full because he had promised he would, and because the alternative felt to him like a form of dishonesty he was not willing to carry. He left the key on the counter, the ledger open on the last page, and walked out into a Birmingham morning that smelled of coal smoke and autumn and indifferent progress. He was 29 years old. He found work eventually as a warehouse clerk in Coventry, the same kind of work he had done at 14, before hope had made him believe something different was possible. He worked there for 31 years. He never opened another shop. He never spoke much about the Birmingham years, at least not to anyone who left a record of it. Somewhere in the city, in a municipal archive that few people visit and even fewer think to search, there is a lease document from 1867 with his careful, slightly labored handwriting at the bottom, a signature made by a man who believed on that particular morning that the world rewarded the kind of effort he was prepared to give. That document is one of the only things that proves Thomas Alderton was ever there at all.